Alright, so intimate apparel. So one thing that I noticed kind of right at the beginning of the play was the perspective on corsets in the year 1905 when the play is set. I could tell right away that the play was written in a modern time, it was written in the early 2000s, so I can really tell that just based on how the characters discuss the idea of corsetry and their opinions on it, because at that time, that was very much still an accepted and very okay thing, not like it isn't today, but it's not so common as it was back then. Back then corsets were the equivalent of the modern bra. They provided support and also helped give that fashionable shape, and most times it didn't actually squeeze people in the way that we like to think that they did today. So one of the values that I'm sure a lot of you also saw in the play was the one of marriage. Now from page 1 all the way to the end, marriage is a pretty consistent theme. Esther starts out saying, oh, I don't know if I'll ever marry, I'm 35, I'm kind of old, don't know if I'll ever actually do that, and then everyone's kind of telling her, oh, you should get married, that's just the thing to do. And then of course she does get married, she kind of rushes into things pretty quickly, and then she gets her heart broken because her marriage doesn't quite work out the way she thought it would. But marriage was such an important aspect in society at the time, so I can see why it's included in the play, for sure. And the other value I saw was that of dreams and ambitions and that kind of thing. We hear that Esther is saving all of her money in that quilt because she wants to open a beauty parlor, and she mentions that to a couple people throughout the play, and they kind of discourage her. She's like, I want to live my dream, and then everyone's like, you can't really do that because as a person of color, that's not something that's going to be accepted or not going to make it. They kind of crush her dreams a little bit. So if you couldn't tell, I do know a little bit about corsets in their historical context because I had to write a paper on it last year. But I wanted to do a little more research into what they meant by a low-cut corset throughout the story. Earlier in the play, Mrs. Van Buren walks out of her dressing area and she's wearing this low-cut corset, which is really fashionable at the time. And that's kind of mentioned a couple times throughout the play. So I wasn't exactly sure what a low-cut corset meant in this context. Throughout history, corsets were worn, as I said, like the modern bra is today, but it also gave women the fashionable shape for clothing. Not saying everyone wore them for that reason, but it was definitely a part of just what you wore on a daily basis. Now, women at the time liked to have their fronts kind of shaped like this, a very curved, smooth thing. So corsets didn't have to come up super high back then. A low-cut corset would sit right about here. And what did this teach me about the play? This taught me that the character of Mrs. Van Buren is actually pretty fashionable because she seems to have a bit of money and is getting new clothes made for her, at least fairly frequently. So she requests, the most in-fashion things like she did for that. I think it was like a singer or something. So the representation of the African-American experience is very much present in this play because it is told from the perspective of an African-American woman. We see a lot of common, stereotypes, I guess, of the African-American experience of Esther being illiterate. And whenever Esther's asked if she's been to the opera, she obviously says no because she hasn't. And she asks Mrs. Van Buren if she can take her, and she says no because that probably wasn't allowed in that time. It would have been not proper for a white lady to take a person of color with them to a pretty prestigious location. And the one thing that I thought was actually really kind of sad was the 2 photographs that are taken of Esther and then of Esther and her husband, I guess. They just say things like unidentified Negro seamstress, unidentified Negro couple. Now that being said, in the play, I think some stereotypes are reinforced a little bit, but I think there's a lot more depth given to them and maybe a little bit of reinvention going on. Part of her life sounds really similar to that struggle. And on top of that, Esther just has so much more depth to her character, and she has hopes and she has dreams, and that just adds another layer to that African-American experience that we talked about before. Now, do these stereotypes still exist today? Of course they do. Stereotypes tend to last a long time until they die out. And a stereotype can't really die out until people stop talking about it, until it stops being reinforced. And a stereotype really cannot go out until it is shown that it's not always true. And even if that is done, that does not guarantee that a stereotype will not still be, in the minds of people in a society. Now, I wanted to find some stereotypes for examples on the African-American or minority situation, so I asked one of my friends who is a person of color because I did not feel right just making those up on my own thoughts. So the ones she gave me were that Black people don't always have fathers, Black people are always poor, Jews are greedy, Asian people are good at math, Muslims are a threat to national security, that whole thing. Yikes. Those are some pretty extreme stereotypes, but we do kind of see some of that throughout the story with social conventions and expectations. And so for my two questions on the play, the first one is, do you think George ever had feelings for Esther, or was he in it for the money the whole time? And the second is, what do you think the significance behind the title Intimate Apparel is?